I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Today we are turning to Book 3. Last time we had met, we finished Book 2 of the Ethics, which does the introduction, deals with the turn to the virtues, the character virtues, and some background of it. I'm mostly giving a general outline. Starting in 3 and 4, well, 3 and 4 will be about going in more detail to the specific key virtues that he talked about, the character virtues, right? But he's going to start out today in chapter 1 of book 3 on the question of the difference between, the voluntary and the involuntary, right? So let's talk about this in that sense. Chapter 1. Since virtue concerns passions as well as actions, involuntary actions, right, elicit praise and blame, whereas involuntary one elicit forgiveness and sometimes pity. And it is perhaps necessary for those who are examining virtue to define the voluntary and the involuntary. So, first of all, we have to look at the word. There's a note here, and this is the word for forgiveness, and that is sungomi. But the problem with in book 3, he translates sugomi as forgiveness, right? But in book 6, in chapter 11, and book 7, he will translate the same word as sympathy. What he means here is, in both cases, sugomi is about the difference whether you the idea here is regarding actions, okay, passions and actions. And I would even argue the problem is, are passions voluntary? That's the question. But actions are. We have to, he distinguishes here more with the question of actions. Regarding actions, right? Since virtue does concern both passion as well as actions, the problem here is voluntary. The voluntary range. Again, in the Greek, there's no actions here. Okay, it's the voluntary illicit praise and blame, whereas the involuntary ones, right? Whether passions or actions. Okay, this is the problem. The involuntary elicit forgiveness, or if not forgiveness, sympathy, right? And sometimes even pity. I think maybe even keeping sympathy might be useful, because he's saying here we don't blame it. We understand. In other words, it's not something we're going to blame necessarily. We're not going to praise it either, but we'll understand it, and we'll kind of feel sorry for it, right? That's why I think he uses the word. And we it's not, and I think we might not necessarily forgive. See, I think forgiveness may actually be too strong here, but I understand. We understand it. In other words, we might not. The question of the involuntary, like, we're not going to put. It's like murder. We commit murder, commit a crime. The involuntary crime versus the voluntary crime, we often degree the type of punishment we'll get. We still might punish something that was involuntarily done, but the one that was voluntarily done deserves more blame. Okay, in that sense. So therefore, this is what he wants to get to here. That it's and therefore we not we have and therefore in this question we have to distinguish between the voluntary and the involuntary. Any discussion of action would have to understand, and even passion, maybe even passion. We'll have to understand the question of the involuntary versus the voluntary, right? And he goes, doing so is useful also for lawgivers, with a view both to honors and punishment. In other words, okay, are we going to reward someone? In the concern of honors and punishment, you want to honor those who willingly do things, who choose voluntarily do things. The people who involuntarily do the right thing are less praiseworthy than those who willingly do the right thing. Likewise, those who unwillingly do the bad thing are less blameworthy than those who, in deserving punishment, as those who willingly do the bad thing. Okay, that's the whole point here. So therefore, it's going to lawgivers have to pay attention to this to modify the question both of honors and punishments. Honors are kind of carrots, and punishment is sticks, right? Now, things that come about as a result of force or on accounts of ignorance seem to be involuntary. Seem, in other words, things that come because of force, something that's like force, and he means force here of like compulsion, coercion, some kind of aspects of it, something that it's you just do it, push it like this, and or ignorance that you don't know, you didn't know anything, and you did it without knowledge in that sense. This seems to be we would consider both these aspects things done out of because coercion was applied or force was applied. In other words, you had no choice in the matter in that sense. Um, um, this is what we consider these seem to be involuntary. That which is force, and here it is the word here, bleos, has both an active sense, which is doing the forcing, right? And more frequently in the ethics, a passive one, which is being forced, right? Here is active and passive. Beos and the active is doing the forcing, and passive, this term we use in the passive sense, it is having the force done to you, right? Being forced, and this is how it's more often used in the ethics, not of forcing, but rather being forced upon, right? Um, okay. So that which is force is something whose origins are external, since it's the sort of thing to which the person who is acting or undergoing something contributes nothing. For example, if a wind or people who have control over someone should carry him off someplace. In other words, he's not doing it. In other words, it's something external acting on them, right? And then either they them. In other words, either what he says, either who is acting on, or undergoing something that they undergo something, which force is physically making them do something, right? And he gives the example of some a wind or people coming over and have control over someone, carry them off, right? But as as for all that is done on account of fear of greater harm, or on account of something beautiful, noble, for example. If a tyrant should order someone to do something shameful, while the tyrant has control over the parents or offsprings, and if he should do it, they would be saved, but not, they would be killed. Whether this kind of thing is involuntary or involuntary admits dispute. In other words, there's a question here. There's a dispute. There is the question of it's less disputable if the force is actually acting on you, right? In that sense, that if it's acting directly on you, that you're picked up, you're taken, you're doing something, you're done this, versus being taking your family. In other words, a threat on your family that if you don't do this horrible thing or this thing that they want you to do, your lover, your friend, your family will be punished. If you don't, they won't be. Okay, this indirect, in other words, extortion, threats. That is not actually. In other words, coercion isn't actually directly being done, but it's kind of like a promise to do it if you don't do it, right? So therefore, there's a distinction here. In Aristotle wants to maybe say, well, it's clearer when the action is being done directly towards you, right, on you, versus the threat of doing it. This is less. He's saying that there's a debate here. Some might argue you're not you wouldn't have done it, but the fact that if your children didn't get your wife and you weren't being if they weren't being going to be killed, you'd do it. Something comparable occurs also when it comes to casting off a cargo in storms, right? For in an unqualified sense, no one voluntarily jettisons cargo. But when one's own preservation and that of the rest are at issue, everyone who has sense would do it, right? This is here sense, nous. Like this is interesting. Now this is nous. This is the word nous, and he uses the word nous here. Sense here. It's very interesting. I would even argue the problem here is nous. Nous is in turning in intellect, right? He uses nous as the word that we as a understanding something. It's an understanding. He, not sense in the terms of this is why I think this is a. I think he's they both of them are good by highlighting this because a translator who doesn't highlight that he's using sense here may lead someone to kind of misunderstand because our ordinary understanding of sense is this perception of what we see, right? Things that we perceive. Here, this is common sense, right? This is, I think, has common sense, would say. Anyone who's common sense. And what is common sense is a kind of judgment, right? We would understand here, and I think this is why nous is used here as a kind of understanding. In other words, a kind of judgment about knowing. A judgment come from knowing, right? Something that we know something here. So somebody who has judgment on this, who knows what is at stake. And remember, nous is traditionally, in its more extreme, its proper understanding, nous is the application of reasoning, that is truing and falsing, regarding the arche, the starting points, the first principles, the first arche, starting points, or axioms in for deductive reasoning and other, or understanding the forms in the Platonic senses. The nous is that apprehensions of the first things, or the arche, the fundamental principles, okay? This is noetic in that sense. This is what that we understand it. Whereas here, the use in the ordinary sense of noetic is an understanding. It's an understanding of what needs to be done or should be done in that sense. The correct thing to do, right? So it is knowing there's an action in it, and it's not okay. The correct thing to do in action, in terms of strict action, we would normally translate when we look at book 6. We'll see that more clearly developed when he sketches book 6 and the virtues of the intellect. Right here is that we would say, okay, there's something problematic. Preservation, we jettison cargo. One wouldn't ordinarily jettison cargo. Okay. But if the ship, their own preservation or the ship's preservation, they will do it. It makes sense to do it in that sense, right? And that's what sense means. What is sensible? What is reasonable in that sense? What is reasonable? What is understandable in that sense? These sorts of actions then are mixed. Though, in other words, he wants to talk about both the blackmailing, the first case and the next case, these two things. One is that you're being threatened. And also this case of where there's a danger and that you wouldn't normally do it, but in this case it's intelligible to do it, right? So these sorts of actions then are mixed, though they are more voluntary than involuntary. They are choice worthy at the time they are done, and the action and the end of the action accords with what is opportune at the moment. No, opportune at the moment. What is useful, opportune. This idea of what does opportune means? Opportune means what is kind of it's kind of like beneficial, good. It's not. It's important that we don't. He doesn't use the word good here. Opportune is opportunity, right? It comes from opportune. What is useful? What is useful? It's what is also beneficial. See, but the problem with beneficial is that the beneficial has a connotation with the good, or the correct. In other words, the question with the correct, the ortho, and the maybe even the good, what is right, okay, even what is just, okay. In other words, there's an intersect here. Now, not all opportune things are right. Not all opportune things are right. Some opportune things may be unjust, okay, or incorrect. Correct, right? Orthos. So, what is opportune at the moment? Okay, therefore, it's choice worthy at the time being done, and the end of the action accords to what was opportune at that moment, right? And I think here, this is more. I think it's clearer in the second case of the ship, the cargo and the ship and the storm, than the first case of the question of there's a tyrant and you're told to do something or your family will be punished. Um, um, the first case, I think I'm not. It's clearer that this argument here is more tied to the second case, but it also might be tied to the first. He doesn't kind of give a kind of justification, or not justification, but a kind of explanation that deals with the motivation, right? It's clearly the motivation in the first case. The second case, again, we see the motivation. Here he gives an explanation of the logic underneath the problem and why it's a combination of it is something that is voluntary, right? And but yet at the same time, um, in other words, it's a mixed in the sense. It's sort of that it's more voluntary than involuntary. But okay, so again, let's continue this. Both what is voluntary and involuntary then must be spoken of with reference to when someone acts. So that it's clear. Now, this is why he explains why he then goes above, and why he explicitly adds action. And in other words, he goes over here and puts action here, even though it's not there, because he's clarifying that the involuntary then must be spoken of with reference to when someone acts, so action. And now again, the bracket means he's adding something, so it's added in here. The translator is adding to kind of give meaning, so it's clarity. And the person who acts voluntarily, for in fact, the origins of the movement of parts, that is the body, right, moving of the parts, serves as instrument in such actions, is the person himself. So, in other words, that the parts that move us, our arms, our legs, the parts of our soul, right, the desiring, the spirited, and the rational, and the famous classical Platonic, the Socratic tripartite of the soul, right? That all this is one. It's the parts and the one, the body, the arm, the legs, the thing. The parts are just till it's tied to our person. So, an example he gives of the hand, right? The hand, the hand. In the case of the hand, the person acts voluntary, and for the fact that the hand does something, the hand is being controlled by the whole in that sense, right? Um, and serves as an instrument in such actions is the person himself. And in those cases in which the origin is in the person himself, it is also up to him to act or not to act. So therefore, if the origin of the thing that is causing the part to act is the person, the self, right? He's kind of suggesting. If I said I'm doing this, right? Therefore, this is voluntary. Therefore, those cases in which the origin is in the person himself, it is up to him to act or not to act. And such cases, therefore, are voluntary, though not in an unqualified sense. They are perhaps involuntary. So, therefore, there's something. We think about this for a second. There's a moment. The question is something that inside of it. Now, he's saying that most actions that come from ourselves are going to be perceived as voluntary, but he flags it immediately. Though in an unqualified sense, in other words, somewhat, and that is like what happens. We in psychology we talk about people who have certain phobias or fears or kind of irrational quirks, something that kind of makes them misunderstand something, right? And therefore, is that voluntary? Did they choose to be that way? No. So therefore, he's raising this question of, well, but there may be situations where it's not always going to be voluntary if it's from the actor himself. There are some situations, he goes, some such cases are generally voluntary, but although not in an unqualified sense, they are perhaps involuntary. Some are involuntary. For no one would choose anything of this sort in itself. So, in other words, the question is something that you wouldn't necessarily optimally choose. It doesn't make sense that you're choosing such a thing. Okay? But you're choosing anyways. Well, if that's the case, if you're doing, in other words, you're acting contrary to expectations. Something that would, something that we would, the majority of people, the norm, right, a distribution norm, the majority of people are going to be doing this, and therefore, and there's a connection between doing this and benefiting of it, right? Therefore, we'd expect you to do it. But then someone who, instead of doing it, does something completely opposite. Even though the thing that makes sense for them to do it, but they don't do it. Actually, they do the opposite, and they harm. They, this is there something involuntary in that sense, right? In such actions, people are sometimes even praised when they endure something shameful or painful in return for great and noble, beautiful things. In other words, they don't necessarily are okay. It's going to be painful, harmful, and they want to avoid pain. But this thing is very good. They wouldn't necessarily, in other words, they go for it or do it, right? They endure pain and what? Maybe even suffering, right? This idea that shame, they may even endure something shameful or painful in return for great noble things. And therefore, in this situation, in such actions, some people are even praised when they do something that they're not inclined not to do, right? They're not inclined to do it. In fact, they're suffering pain for it, right? But they've done something. They endure something for this in return for great and noble things, right? But should the contrary occur, they are blamed when they do. They suffer pain or something shameful for something ignoble or non-noble, base, low things. But should the contrary occur, they are blamed. For it belongs to a base person to endure shameful things in the service of nothing beautiful or measured. Now this is the flipping it around. In other words, great versus noble. Then here it's the ta kalos, the noble here. Nothing ta kalos. Or now measured, something measured, that means something, okay, something has value, something that has something that you can give measurement to or worth something. Um, and that is something without lacking greatness in that sense. So, great, we can know, great is superlative, right? We know it's a lot of something, okay? Something great has a lot of worth, a lot of value, a lot of merit, okay? But something without is nothing measured in that sense, without that value. In some actions, not praise, but forgiveness and understanding, right, surgery, arises whenever someone does what he ought not to do because the matter involved surpasses human nature and could not be endured by him. In other words, we're going to understand. We're going to maybe forgive. That translates as forgiveness, but it's again that word. We go back all the way to the sun gomi, We understand what's going on here. We can forgive or sympathize with, not praise, but forgiveness or forgiveness about sympathize arises whenever someone does what he ought not to do because matters involve surpassing our nature, what we can do, and could be endured by no one. In other words, this is the idea. When someone is being tortured, the person who resists, the guy who goes under torture and refuses to give the information and never reveals the information. And, this is the most high praiseworthy. So this is, we give honor to that. But the guy is being tortured, really tortured. Now, the mere threat of torture, you don't do it. That is, you have less sympathy for that. It's the mere threat of it. Okay. But the one who endures some torture, who endures physical pain that no one can endure, but then gives up the information, we understand that. Okay, that was always the code in the code is that you don't have to. It's in Vietnam they're talking about the people who the Vietnamese were torturing American prisoners to get information, even against the Geneva Convention in that sense. And the rule about this is that, of course, eventually everyone breaks, right? Everyone breaks in that sense. So therefore, there's no dishonor in breaking, but there's a dishonor not to resist, to simply collaborate without resisting is not noble. But breaking itself is not ignoble or something understandable in that sense, right? Some things, perhaps, it is not possible to be compelled to do. One ought instead to die while suffering the most. In other words, one ought to die while suffering the most terrible things, right? So it's not easy to compel people to do certain things. One ought to die, but people will still ought to survive, right? Indeed, the considerations that compelled Euripides Alcmon to commit matricide if fear is laughable. Now, this is a very thing. We only have a fragment of Euripides' play to which Aristotle refers to here. See also this line where Aristotle quotes from the play. According to the Scholasticist, Achaemen's father was persuaded to fight at Thebes by his wife Eurypile, who had been bribed by the promise of a necklace. He was killed at the battle, but he learned of her treachery. And while he was dying, he commanded his sons to kill his mother, placing a curse on him should he not comply. Right. So, in other words, it becomes kind of like the drama, the logic of what causes the action in the drama. This is kind of, he says, it's laughable. In other words, that my wife lied to me, and I'm going to curse you if you don't kill your mother. This is laughable in that sense, right? This is the consideration that compelled Alcmon to commit matricide. At one point appears laughable, but it is difficult sometimes to decide what sort of thing one ought to choose in return for what, and what ought to be endured in return for what. In other words, this is a question. This is a problem. In other words, at one level, the example of that case and that drama, that drama that he mentions, it appears laughable. But what about? But the question of what should you endure for what? In other words, it's difficult to decide what sort of thing one ought to choose in return for what, and what ought to be endured in return for what. It is still more difficult to abide by the judgments one makes as in each case, since for the most part the things people anticipate in such circumstances are very painful, and those who are compelled to do are shameful. They don't want to do it. They don't want to do it. When they're forced to do it, they do something they don't want to do. It's shame. They feel shame in that sense, right? Which is why praise and blame are dependent on whether the people in question are compelled or not to act as they do, or compelled or compelled not to act as they do. So, in other words, coercion in that sense. In other words, we add. In other words, this is the problem here. They're feeling shame about what they did. They don't want to do it. It's not something they themselves would choose to do, right? Um, um, uh, uh, um, that's what that makes it more. This makes it a mix. This is why it's a mixed problem, right? There is something involuntary because if you felt shame about it, you know it's wrong, right? You know it's wrong, but you're doing it anyways. But you're being forced to do it. The question is, I knowing what is wrong and doing it anyways, but you do so because you get pleasure from it, right? You're going to get some benefit or some good from it, something useful or something you like, something that's you want. But again, you know it's wrong, right? There is a sense of shame. But the question here is, and in that situation, there is blame to be placed. I that I know that this is wrong, but I do it anyway, right? And I do so because I want to do it, because I'm getting something I want from it, right? By breaking the law, by breaking the norm, or breaking the rule, breaking the thing I know is wrong. I'm choosing to do bad because I'm going to get some benefit or use or opportunity, right? Or the other case is when you know it's wrong and you're doing it not because you want to, but because other outside forces are forcing you to. This is less blameworthy, right? So therefore, the things people anticipate in these situations are painful, and those who are compelled to do are shameful, right? If you're forced to do something you don't want to do, or something that's compelled. Um, and this is why plays and play dependent upon whether the people in question are compelled or not to act as they do. What sort of actions then must be declared to be forced? So this raises the question: what kind of actions have to be declared to be forced? Or in an unqualified sense, do forced actions occur whenever their cause is found in external things, and the person who acts contributes nothing to them? So the first problem. So what is the forced? Right? When is an action forced? Now, is it in an unqualified sense when the action has done something else? In other words, is the cause of the action is found in external things and the person contributes nothing to them? In other words, it's complete, or in other words, that's one thing. But we know that there's the mixed situation, right? So therefore, this would exclude the mixed, only the things that are that. But as for the actions that are themselves involuntary and yet choice worthy at the present moment in return for specific things, and whose origins is in the person who acts, these actions in themselves are involuntary, but at the present moment, in return for these specific things, they are voluntary. So they're both at one level involuntary, but at another level, because they're at the present moment in return for those specific things, they're voluntary. Yet they are more like voluntary actions, for actions reside in particulars, and these are voluntary. So therefore, in other words, his point is actions reside in the particular. So therefore, because at the present moment and return for these things, okay, yes, the larger issue, you don't want to do it. You wouldn't like to, you know it's bad. You know doing this is bad, and you know that you shouldn't do it, and you know that it brings shame to do this kind of thing. But at the moment, it's beneficial. It's useful or opportune, right? Um, uh, uh, um, and you get something that you value or want, right? So therefore, they are like voluntary actions because they reside in particulars. What sort of things ought to be chosen in return for what is not easy to explain, for there are many distinctions involved in the relevant particulars. So, in other words, it's again depends on what is the question. What is the particulars? What is the particulars? What should be done for what in return? What things ought to be chosen in return for what? This is not clear. He's saying it's not easy to explain. Because why? Because the distinctions involved in these things are always going to be relevant to the particular situation. If someone should declare that present things, pleasant things, and beautiful things, noble, kalos things, are characterized by force, for they exercise compulsion, right, while being external, then in this way everything would be forced. It is for the sake of these things that everyone does everything. So, and he's making very interesting, saying that if we declare that the pleasant, if everyone should declare, if someone should declare that present things and noble things are characterized by force, well, because why? Because they're for the exercise by compulsion, and that is, in this way, everything would be by force. It is for the sake of these things. In other words, it's for the sake of the pleasant and the beautiful, the kalos, the good noble, the kalos. We do things because they're pleasant, pleasant, and everything is done this way. We can never escape it. Then everything is involuntary, right? And people who act as a result of force and involuntarily, not do not do choice. In other words, who act because of force and not because they actively do so, voluntary, willing to do so painfully, while those who act on account of what is pleasant and noble do so with pleasure. So in other words, this is weird. He's making a very interesting, he's now saying, well, if I do it because I'm doing this, I want what is pleasant and I want what is noble, beautiful, noble, kalos. It's pleasurable. It's good, beneficial. So therefore, I would think this would be like, why would I need force to do this, right? I do so with pleasure, right? I would do it with pleasure, not therefore. But those who have to do things that are, in other words, act as a result of force and do so, it's pain. I'm doing because I'm under pain, right? I'm doing this because if I don't do it, I don't want to do it, right? So therefore, that's a very much distinction here between. But it is laughable to attribute to external things the cause of one's being easily snared by such things, rather than to attribute the cause to oneself, as is ascribing the cause of noble things to oneself, but the shameful things to one's pleasures. Right. This is that famous. The verb here is. The verb here is translated as to attribute the cause to, right? Anastai can carry also the moral condemnation, to blame, right? Etastenai, I can't even get this. I can never pronounce these. Even though I studied Greek all my life, I never can pronounce these sounds. I can read it. I know the word. I say, okay, that means that. Etestesai. This is what? This is to attribute to the cause to, right? This is why it's the note here. It's like, this is why. Tribute to external cause, right? The external thing to cause. And this is two sense. It attribute to a cause, but it's also what? Something moral, blame. We can blame it. So what is this thing is, it's kind of laughable that we attribute what? To attribute to external causes, right? As when being ensnared by such things, that we're forced to do it like this, in that sense, right? Rather than to attribute the cause to oneself. As if attributing causes of noble things to oneself, right? When we do noble things, it's our things. But when we don't choose the noble things, right? We should do shameful ones. That's because of pleasures. We have no control over that. This we have control. When we do noble things, we have control. We should be praised. We have control. We chose those. But when we do the wrong thing, and we did it only because our pleasures, this seems to be laughable in that sense. That which is force then appears to be something whose origin is external, while he who is forced contributes nothing thereto. So he's going to make a point that it's the action is external. In other words, he wants to make a point here. That which is forced then appears to be something whose origins are eternal. That's the very point. It appears to be origins. In other words, he's now asserting that it's not the question In other words, it can't be simply that things that we only things that we choose. When we do good things, this is when we choose it. But when we do bad things, external, involuntary, right? Uh, uh, and it's due to our pleasures because everything is. In other words, he says, in fact, if that's the case, because we always do things for the sake of the noble and the pleasure, the pleasant, right? And as a general principle, and therefore that's the case, then we'd have no choice, right? Everything would be in that sense. But then we do is we say, oh, but we make when they choose good things. He's saying here, and it's kind of laughable this division, right? He says. So, but he's now saying here at the end of this paragraph, he's saying that while the force then appears to be something whose origin is external, and while he is forced to contribute, the one who's forced contributes nothing. He doesn't choose it himself. It's not because of him. Next paragraph. What is done on account of ignorance? So the forced, it's more problematic. In other words, previously we talked about the question of force, right? Now we can turn to ignorance. On account of ignorance. What is done on account of ignorance is in every case not voluntary. But it is involuntary only when it causes the person who acts to feel pain and regret. So in other words, technically, ignorance, every case is not voluntary. But we will consider it is involuntary only when the person who acts or fails to act feels pain and regret. For the person who does anything, what on whatever anything whatever on account of ignorance, while feeling no degree of disgust at the action, has not acted voluntarily, since he at least did not know what he was doing, and yet he has not in turn acted involuntary either, since since he is not pained by so acting. Okay, so therefore this is a case. This is another mixed case. It's I know it's wrong, I do it, but I'm not shamed about it. I know I shouldn't do it, I do it anyways, but I feel no pain about doing it. I know I should have done it, I don't know I should have done it, I don't do it, but I feel no shame about doing it. In that sense, when I get, in other words, not, in other words, this is the thing is that you feel no shame or disgust about this, right? For the person, in other words, who does anything, whether on account of ignorance, while feeling no degree of disgust of the action, has not acted voluntary, since he at least did not know what he was doing. Yet, and he has not in turn acted voluntary either, since he is not pained by doing acting. In these cases of what is done on account of ignorance, then he who feels regret seems to act involuntarily. But as for the person who is without regret, since he is different, let his actions be non-voluntary, right? But we're still going to blame him in that sense. We're not going to receive playroom. For since they differ, it is better that each have their own name. He says we have to, in other words, not. In other words, they're not involuntary; they're non-voluntary. Because the question of voluntary and voluntary and non-voluntary requires it requires what? Ignorance means you don't know, so it can't be voluntary. So the question now, but if you then don't feel pain about it or regret when you do it, then what? Then what? Therefore, this suggests not voluntary, but the opposite, right? That it's non-voluntary, and we choose the difference between the involuntary and the non-voluntary in terms of the different because these things have their own name. Acting on account of ignorance seems different also from acting in ignorance. So, acting on account of ignorance is different in ignorance. For he who is drunk or angry is not held to act on account of ignorance, but rather on account of one of the things stated, drunkenness or anger, and not with knowledge, but in ignorance. In other words, he's drunk, and because of that, he's in ignorance, not because he's ignorant. Everyone who has everyone who is corrupt then is ignorant of what he ought to do. In other words, and to abstain from doing, right? And through this sort of error, people become unjust and bad in general. So, in other words, everyone who is corrupt then is ignorant of what he ought to do. That's the logic of this thing, right? And people become unjust and bad in general. But one does not wish to use the term involuntary when someone is ignorant of what is advantageous. So we don't want to use the term involuntary when someone is ignorant of what is advantageous. For the ignorance involved in one's choice is the cause, not of what is involuntary, but of one's corruption. So this is interesting. In other words, we don't want to use the term involuntary when someone is ignorant of what is the question of what is advantageous. In other words, for ignorance involved in one's choice is the cause, not of what is involuntary, but of the corruption, or not, the corruption. Nor is the ignorance of the relative general principle, general arche, the principle, the cause of an act being voluntary. So what he's saying. Nor is the ignorance of the relative general principle the cause of the act being is the cause of the act being voluntary, involuntary. For people are indeed blamed on account of this sort of general ignorance. In other words, we don't know that we should not this general principle, but we're still blamed when we do it. We're ignorant of the principle, but we know this. No, we should know. For people are indeed blamed of this sort of general ignorance. The cause, rather, is the ignorance pertaining to the various particulars, both in the circumstances of the action and what it concerns. So, therefore, it's ignorant. In other words, the cause of this problem is the ignorance pertaining to the various particulars, both the circumstances of the action and what it concerns. In these later cases, there is both pity and forgiveness. And understand, this is, again, forgiveness is the wrong word. I maybe sympathy, pity, and sympathy, since he who is ignorant of any of these particulars act in that sense involuntary. In other words, you don't know what this is not. You're unaware of the circumstances of what happens. You're ignorant of that situation, both in circumstances of the actions and what it concerns. You do it, but you don't know the circumstances why what happens. This is like this. You don't understand the general problems and the general principle involved. There is both pity and understanding or forgiveness in that sense, right? Sympathy. Again, that's the thing. You don't know. The question is, we know. Okay, this is Oedipus, right? The whole Oedipus, right? Oedipus. Well, he knows he shouldn't kill his father, right? He kills a man, and he runs across a guy who is threatening him, arrogant, and he thinks he's defending himself, and he kills the guy who turns out to be his father. He then goes to the city, and the king is dead, and he's now welcome, and he marries a person. The rule is that you're going to they make him as king, and therefore they're going to make the old wife of the old king is now going to. He didn't know that the guy was king. He didn't know it was his father. And the woman that he is now going to marry is his mother. He doesn't know this. He's ignorant of who's who and the circumstances of what. So therefore, this is why we pity. It's wrong, and we have pity and sympathy sympathy for Oedipus. This is what I think. But this is why he does. This is why the question. This is the example of that sense. Perhaps then it is not the worst thing to distinguish what and how many these particulars are. So it's, in other words, it is not the worst thing to distinguish what and how many these particular the things are. That is, who acts, what he does, and respect to what, or in what circumstances. In other words, we have to pay attention to this. Who's acting? What is he doing, or he, she doing? With respect to what, or in what circumstances? And sometimes also with what, for example, is an instrument. With what? What are the tools he's using? What is the instrument? Okay, this is the, and sometimes with what, I mean the instrument in question, right? For the sake of what, for example, preservation, or I'm going to make wealthy. In other words, is the thing he's doing it, is the why he doing it or she doing it? What is the sake or the why are they doing it, right? The why they're doing it. Is it something, is the why they're doing it, is it something reasonable, praiseworthy, blameworthy, unreasonable, unreasonable, something sensible, like preserving oneself is understandable, it's rational. Risk, dying, choosing to suffer and die, this is, you would not normally choose this. Choosing to shave oneself and preserve oneself, this is understandable. So the reasonable here. The second level is something that's shameful, doing something that is good and beautiful versus something that is shameful and bad, right? So again, this is the way we can highlight this in that double sense. Why we're doing it, right? For the sake of what? Here, the example is preservation. And how? How it's being done? Is it being done gently or violently, for example, right? So therefore, this is the great point. This is his model saying, okay, this is how we have to understand. Therefore, we're going to understand the action. We have to understand, well, who's acting, what he's doing, in respect to what or in what circumstances he did this. Then, how is he doing it in terms of the instruments, right? Why is he doing it, and how is he doing it, right? So, what is the instrument? The way he's doing it, kind of a double how, the two how. The one is instrument. What is he doing? How is he? What tools are he doing? What is the means he's doing it, right? And how is whether he's doing it. The general manner of it. The general manner. Here is the specifics of the means, and here is the kind of the general character of how it's being done, right? That's how you break it up in that sense. Now, no one could be ignorant of all these things unless he were mad, crazy. And it is clear that he or the person would not be ignorant of the person who is acting either. For how could he be ignorant of himself? So it's even that I know that I'm acting. Unless you have to be really, really crazy on it. You don't realize that this is being done and you're doing it, okay? This has to be really mad. To be ignorant of all these things. But now this is interesting. You start with 3 and 3. There's the first 3, and the third one has a double two possibilities that of in respect to what and or in what circumstances, right? And then the next, sometimes the additional material is threefold also. What? Well, with what? I mean, is the means, the specific means you're doing it by, right? The next one is for this. What is the reason why you're doing it? And then the next one is the how or the manner you're doing, right? So the idea that it's impossible to be ignorant of all these 6 categories here. Because how would you be ignorant of yourself doing it, right? Anyone who is all 6 are mad in that sense, right? Crazy, something wrong with them. But someone could be ignorant of what he is doing. For example, people declare that they had slipped they had a slip of the tongue while speaking, or that they did not know what they said was forbidden, as Aeschylus said about the mysteries. Okay, this is that famous story from a Norse play of Euripides. Um, Okay, sorry. According to the famous story, the great tragic poet Aeschylus was brought before the Areopagus and charged with the virgin secrets of the Eleusinian mysteries. He defended himself by arguing that he had never been initiated into the mysteries and said only what came to his lips. He was acquitted on a charge. So that's the example of the Aeschylus, right? Aeschylus had was said about the mysteries. I wasn't sorry. I wasn't. I didn't. I wasn't initiated in the mystery, so I don't know what they were. I don't have knowledge of what they are. So what I said was simply accidentally. I said that. Yeah, it's a mystery. Well, I didn't know it was that because I was never taught that, and therefore it's a slip of the lip. Right, right. Of mysteries, and fellow said about the. In other words, or that or as the fellow said about the catapult, that he set it off while wishing simply to exhibit it. I mean, it was Poland. There was a joke about this. A police officer had a rocket launcher and he was just showing off, and he didn't realize it was loaded. He didn't know it was a valid rocket. He fired the missile and the anti-tank weapon in the office and blew up the wall. Okay, this is an example of this. Okay, I didn't know. I was just showing the catapult. I didn't know I was going. I was only showing it to somebody. I didn't mean to have it go. Okay, oops. Someone might also suppose that his own son is an enemy, just as Mirup did, and that the pointed spear has been blunted, or that the stone is pomus. Right. This, in other words, I don't know. I didn't know that this was person my own son. My own. I didn't. I didn't. One might suppose that his own son is an enemy. Right. As example of this. A story lost poem Epides. Epilope recognizes her son just in time to avoid killing him. Right. This is from the Poetics. Right. Um, in other words, that this I don't see this. I see someone I think is enemy. Don't recognize this as my. I don't recognize this as my son. Okay, and that the pointed spear had been blunted. The point. In other words, the spear that you think is a threat isn't one, or that the stone that's a weapon is not. It's a pomus, right? Or to, or by giving someone a drink to save him, one might kill him, right? I'm doing. In other words, I'm giving someone a drink thinking I was saving him, but rather it kills him, right? Or wishing only to touch, as sparring partners do. Sometimes land a blow. Right? In a sparring situation, I'm only just tapping, right? But what happens instead of tapping, I get a blow, right? So, and these are kind of errors. You don't intend to have the thing. You're doing intending something else, but the opposite occurs. But the question of what you intend to do versus as opposed to what it was done by it, right? So since there are, so since there may be ignorance about all these things that constitute action, he who is ignorant of any of them is held to have acted involuntarily, and especially so in the case of the most authoritative of them, most ruling. Here's authoritative here means the ruling ones. Um, and the most authoritative of ruling seems to be those particular circumstances that constitute the actions and the end for the sake of which it is done. Okay, in other words, the why something is being done. In other words, the most authoritative of this is the why here. Right? The why is something being done. Because why? This is the reason by which things are done. Right? This is it's for this. This is done for the sake of which it is done. Why is it done? Right? It constitutes the action. In other words, those things that constitute the action. So the things that constitute the action. So what is that? That is the question of the mechanisms and how it's being done and to what degree it's being done. And what is that other line? It's I think it's uh, what is done, what is being done, what. who acts, what is being done, and the means he's doing it, both in terms of specific means and then the manner, right? These are tied to each other in that sense. So therefore, this is the most authoritative, right? And the why, right? The why is the end towards which it is being done, right? The why it is being done are the most authoritative in that sense, and constitute the sake of the end of the sake of what it is done. Although an action is said to be involuntary in reference to this sort of ignorance, it must be painful to the person in question and done with regret. In other words, again, there must be regret. It must be painful. In other words, they shouldn't be doing it gleefully. They must be doing it in a sense of I don't want to do this, and it's kind of I'm doing against my inclination or desire or my will, and I'm suffering. I mean, there's some kind of remorse about it, and there's regret and remorse, right? If there's no remorse and no regret, then it's involuntary only in the regards, but there must be pain here and regret. Since what is involuntary is that which is the result of force and done out of ignorance, what is voluntary would seem to be something whose origin is in the person himself, who knows the particular that constitutes the action. So therefore, I do it, and I know the particulars of what the action involves. So the voluntary is a very specific thing. And in other words, the involuntary and the non-voluntary, this is why we distinguish the voluntary versus the non-voluntary. Because even we sometimes will pity the involuntary, but there has to be some remorse, the argument is. There's some things that we don't, it's the actions, the question of, if it's done externally, merely externally, even then we can say involuntary. But if we do it kind of ourselves, but we do it out of ignorance, well, we better have remorse about what has been done. Okay, and if we don't have remorse what is being done, then it moves from the involuntary to the non-voluntary, right? So this is that weird thing here, right? Something of whose origin is in the person himself, and who knows the particulars of that action. For perhaps it is, in other words, for perhaps it is not beautifully or nobly said that it is not nobly said or beautifully said that the involuntary actions are those done on account of spiritedness or desire, okay, thumos and desire. So it's not beautifully, it's not nobly said. In other words, it's not nobly said that the involuntary actions are those done on account of spiritedness and desire. In that case, in in sorry, in that case, in the first place, none of the other animals will ever act voluntarily, nor will children. So therefore, that's the problem, right? If that's the case, in that sense, then animals and children do not act voluntarily. So therefore, in the first place, right, if this is the case, in other words, nothing done it cannot be said that the involuntary actions are done on account of spiritedness or desire. In other words, it has to be choice. If something is done through choice, it's not beautifully said that involuntary actions are those done on account of spiritedness or desire. In that case, none of the other animals will ever act voluntarily. Okay, it's odd. It said that the involuntary actions. It is not nobly said that the involuntary actions are those done on account of spirited. Okay, it's a negative. It's double negative. Okay, that's a Therefore, what he's saying here, voluntary actions are not the actions done because of thumos and desire. These are involuntary. It's not noble to say that actions done these way. In other words, it's not noble to say that involuntary actions are those done on account of spiritedness or desire. In other words, he's saying that it's not beautiful. It it is not nobly said that involuntary actions are those done on account of spiritedness or desire. In that sense, so therefore, but the problem is, but notice that will then say, okay, we're doing it. It's not it's not no beautiful to say, kalos to say that the involuntary actions are those done because of spirit, thumos, and desire, exes, right? Um, but the problem in this case, right? Then the example then he says, in but in this case, right? Continuation. The first place, none of the other animals will ever act voluntary, nor children. Well, how does that follow? I mean, I think there's something wrong in here. I think the next part only makes sense if he's saying how we understand that phrase is that it's a because the animals don't act through pain, act through usually they don't have a situation where they don't act through desire and passion, right? Desire or pain, right? As he says here, right? Um, spiritedness and pain, they act because of that, right? So therefore, they will never act voluntary. So that because in other words, because they act mostly through that, right? So therefore, the question of animals and children are an example of yes, the involuntary, those who act through spiritedness and only spiritedness and desire, not through choice, spiritedness and desire. Because of this, they are they never act voluntarily. Second, we do nothing seemingly from. In other words, we do nothing seemingly from desire or spiritedness voluntarily. So therefore, desire and spiritedness are not necessary to show with, in other words, things that stem from desire and spiritedness. We don't do it voluntarily, nor do we do noble things, nor do we do beautiful things, kalos things, voluntarily, and only shameful ones involuntary. Okay, that's in other words, first of all, nothing from desire and spiritedness. We do nothing seemingly from these things that are choice. It's there's a compulsion, right? This idea we're doing this because this is like kind of forcing us to do this. Therefore, that's not voluntary. The second thing is, at the same time, it is we can't say that when we do something nobly, it's always voluntarily. There's no time ever that we do something noble or beautiful, the kolon, the talk kolon, because of of we're involuntarily. We can, in other words, we can do good things and we can do bad things, either voluntary or involuntary. He's not saying therefore when we do bad things, it's always in other words, he's saying or that we do things noble things voluntary and only shameful things one's voluntary involuntary. No, or is this laughable since they both arise from one cause? In other words, they still have one cause. Everything arises from one cause. Or is it like, or this claim laughable, right? Because that the question is they because since they both arise from one cause, right? It is perhaps strange to declare to be involuntary those things for which one ought to long, and also ought both to be angry at certain things and to desire certain things. For example, health and learning, right? So therefore, in other words, it is strange to declare involuntary those things for which we ought to long, and one ought both to be angry at certain things and to desire certain things. An example, health and learning, right? It seems too that the involuntary things are painful. So even the involuntary things, in other words, first, it's strange to say that in other words, declare that the involuntary things are those which we ought to long and ought to be angry at certain things, at certain things, and to desire certain things, right? That seems strange. But then at the same time, it seems too that the involuntary things are painful. But what what accords with our desires pleasant? So the involuntary things are painful, but the things that are in accord with our desires pleasant. Further, what difference does it make with respect to their being voluntary? So what difference does it make? The action is the action. Whether errors are made by the way of calculation or spiritedness, right? There's still, in other words, there's still errors. The thing's still wrong. What does it make? For both kinds of errors are to be avoided, right? We want to avoid errors. So what difference does it make? He seems to be saying here, right? And the non-rational, in other words, and the non-rational passions. 8. Again, Brett argues that the word passions, pathe, is rightly omitted in from the best manuscript. If so, this line would read, "In what is irrational, irrational is held to be no less characteristically human." Right? So this is why you question: do you keep what is, in other words, here and the non-rational passions seem to be no less characteristically human than calculation or reason, or the opposite. If passion is to be, pathe is to be popped out, not in the manuscript, what is rational is held to be no less characteristically human, right? Than calculation and reason, right? Such that the actions resulting from spiritedness and desire too belong to a human being. In other words, so not only choice, the actions done through choice and pure reasoning and calculation, but also because of spirit, things that we do because of spiritedness and passion, right? Belong to a human being. It is strange then to set these down as involuntary. So therefore, this earlier position that everything that is, in other words, the thing that starts this paragraph, anything that is touched with the beginning claim at the beginning of this paragraph is that anything tied to the passions and that are irrational. So therefore, in other words, he starts that with a claim, and then at the end of the claim, he wraps up saying that that's not reasonable because the human action. Remember, virtue is focusing about human action. Also involves, yes, it involves the question of reason and calculation, but it is also about what? The question of spiritedness and desire, and that therefore to set these as merely involuntary, we sometimes choose those things. So therefore, we have to understand the question of the involuntary is not simply because it's something that the passion that from these sources, but rather something else. Okay, that's how he ends this chapter. It's this introduction chapter of the voluntary, the involuntary. We stop here. It's been a long chapter. This is a very long chapter introduction. We will continue next time in chapter 2, which continues the question of this, right? The involuntary, right? And it goes on to the virtue. If you liked it, hit the like button, share it with your friends, share it out there. Please hit the like button. It helps, please, if you liked it, please hit the like button. It helps get the more people like it. People viewed it, but don't hit the like button. Please do so. It helps the channel to grow. If you've not subscribed, please subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. Bring the attention to this. What we've done here. You get notified by you subscribe. You get notifications of the upcoming videos. You get access to other things if you're not subscribed. But growing the channel helps. Second thing is, if you didn't like it, you did something wrong, or you have a criticism, or things. Okay, you can kind of put the negative comment, hit the thing, but say why in the question. Also, I didn't say so. If you have any comments or questions, please put them in. You should start that out with this. Please put any comments or questions about this chapter in the question block, and I will respond to them when I see them. For those of you who want to follow me on social media, my links to social media links are below. Those who want to know more about my research and my background and things like that, about my academic research and things like that, below the social media are the academic social media links. And those of you who want to help me to do what I do, there's a way to do it. Of course, you can always buy me an Amazon card. find out where my social media, academic social media, you can find where I email is, and you can always do it that way. But I understand the way you can do it so is hit the links through Subscribe Star and Patreon, and that's one way you can, want to assist me doing what I do here. And another way you can assist is buy one of my books. You can do so by, online bookstores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, whatever, or through your local bookstore. The books, the 3 books that I published that are currently available are listed below. Well, that's it. Well, take care. I will see you. We return next time to look at chapter 2. Take care. Bye bye. Have a good